Okay, so the final session we are getting into now will be exploring the impact of targeted interventions in the areas of education, employment, and entrepreneurship, three areas. And we'll see how investing into these areas will help us to harness the discussion we're having today, DD, that's what I call it, demographic dividend. The panel will provide information and key learning that could inform areas of private sector investment and partnerships and a better understanding of the demographic dividend that will arise from such investment. And I'll be calling on 5 people will be joining me for this panel session. And first is Anita Okemini, who is the Policy Director for Rural Development and Inclusive Growth at the One Campaign. Please put your hands together for Anita Okemini. Next is Bamidele Odushote, who is a business analyst with ACIOE Associates of the Albright Stonebridge Group. Bamidele is an economist, has strengths and knowledge and experience lie in strategy, business development, and human resource management. Please put your hands together for Bamidele. Also, I would like to call on Dr. Haliru Bala. Dr. Haliru Bala. Okay, Dr. Haliru Bala was born about 55 years ago in Birnin, Kebbi. Wow, Kebbi State, Nigeria. Sonusa. He attended Usman Danfodio University, Sokoto, where he obtained a BSc degree in management and a master's in business administration from the same university. Thank you very much for joining us, and is currently on secondment, as the Federal Commissioner representing Kebbi State at the National Population Commission, NPC. Also, I would like to call on Mr. Yemi, not Adeyemi, or Mr. Yemi Orimola, the Communications Lead, Microsoft. Please, one more time, help me appreciate the panelists, please. I know we had tea break and we did not have something light, or was it something light? Because you know the thing, I'm not really hungry, but I want something, but it's all right. The first question for, and we'll do ladies first. Why do you think the private sector should invest in harnessing demographic dividend?
So I'll just start and then I can pass it on. So I think there are two major reasons, one from the supply side and one from the demand side. So on the supply side, you have the fact that you need the right capacity of staff to be able to run businesses. So staff capacity has been identified as one of the major hindrances to economic growth and also the proper functioning of businesses in Nigeria. We've seen this through PwC's report in 2016, the Ease of Doing Business report by the World Bank. So that's on the supply side. The private sector should be interested in getting the right staff. On the demand side, what is the aim of every private sector provider? Every private sector company wants to have profit. And how do you do this? By having demand. If you have a population that is able to buy things and is able to spend, by moving the population to a good GDP per capita, then you have a population that can afford to buy your products. So I think on the demand side, you need to ensure that people are employed so that you can have proper demand for your products. So I'll say on the supply and the demand side, it's both important to the private sector.
Okay, let's go to Doctor. So what are your comments, sir?
When you talk of private sector, there is no way public sector can achieve without private sector. No country can develop without private sector in terms of education, employment, and entrepreneurship. When you look at the question critically for critical analysis, the topic is discussing about education, employment, and entrepreneurship as a tool for economic development. Economic development is the mother of any development you can think of. So the variables there are, we have independent variables and dependent variables. education, employment, and entrepreneurship. They are independent variables depending on economic development. So economic development can give room for employment. Economic development can help for education, development in terms of education and entrepreneurship. When you talk of public sector needs private sector in order to develop our country in terms of economic development, which can help demographic dividends. So it is very, very important.
Okay, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Now, this is how we do this. After each panelist gives a comment, you know, it's good that we appreciate them. Is that okay? Is that a good thing for us to do? Don't worry, something heavy is coming after the something light that you have, so not to worry, you'll be fine. So can you please appreciate Dr. Vermi? Thank you. Yes, sir, Mr. Yemi, not Adeyemi.
Yes. So everything that my fellow panelists had said with regards to be it demand supply or how it is crucial for private sector to invest in demographic dividend. Trust me. I think the way I would spin it around is that most times organizations try to be selfish. Selfish in terms, I was having this conversation during the networking session. Organizations just want to use the little they do and make so much noise about it. While what we should be looking at is, yes, the government is doing stuff, right? For government to scale, they need the private partnership. So it's now left for the private organizations to align what their priorities are with that of the government. Then you can scale, right? And that is the way I'm going to say it. So yes, if you say, should the private organization invest in DD? Yes. It is the what and the how.
Which we will get into in a few minutes, you know.
Exactly.
Now, the first panelist said that it's about looking at the demand and the supply side. Doctor said to us that there needs to be alignment between private sector and public sector, and you're saying that private sector need to align their own goals with that of the public sector. Apt. Yes, lady.
Okay, so I quite agree with everything that has been said, but I'm an economist, so I'm going to, crave your indulgence that you follow me through my logical flow of things. So we economists like to look at equations. If you look at all the key variables that equal demographic dividend, you find that those key variables are things that directly influence the success of any business in its host country. So you have governance, which is policies. You have the economy of the country, which is how well they're doing in their numbers. You have the labor, which is human capital. How good is it, the quality. And then you have things like health. Again, strengthening your labor force. So if you look at it, if all these variables are going to directly equal demographic dividend, and these same variables affect your success in your host country, then being the rational human being that you are, it is only wise that you invest in these things. So that's the logical angle. Then there's also a sustainability perspective to it. And I think the goal of every business is not to be successful this year, but to continue to be successful in the years to come, regardless of the changes. So you also want to be at the table when things that cause these changes to happen are being discussed or being played around with. So, and that's where, I'm very passionate about demographic dividend, because it's one of the strong drivers of sustainability. If you invest in things that 10 years to come, you still see results. And as an organization, you're doing the right thing, not only ensuring that you're making profits this year, but you're making profits continuously, leaving a legacy, truly making a name for yourself, like the Microsofts, the IBMs, and many other organizations in this room.
Fantastic. Now, taking it from the variable conversation, please, we agreed to do something. Now, I can't even hear that we agreed to do something. Okay. Thank you. Still doing ladies first for the next comment. Now, looking at variables, looking at sustainability as well, like you mentioned,
What are those opportunities available where private sectors can invest in regarding entrepreneurship and employment? You know, how can we accelerate growth through entrepreneurship and employment opportunities?
Do I start?
Yes.
Okay. As we know, in developing countries, which Nigeria is privileged to be a part of, it's not a bad thing. Everybody has to start from point A before you get to Z. So it's nothing to be ashamed of. As you know, in developing countries, the private sector employs almost as high as 90% of the labor force.
Yeah.
Meaning that they have access to vital data that can be used to shape policy, that can be used to advise, you know, even at the grassroots levels. And I start from, you know, soft things like this so that when we begin to talk about heavier things, it's easy to relate to. So when you say private sector has access to information and data because they employ a large amount of the population, the first thing that comes to mind is then they're the best people to go to if you want to advise on any skills gaps, because they are the ones employing the chunk of the unskilled or underskilled labor. So if they're the ones employing these people and they're the ones having to deal with these deficiency in skills, and they're the best people to go to if you're trying to revamp your curriculum, for example, if you're trying to expand on what you currently have in your vocational training, or if you're trying to make policies that allow us to better cater to, you know, the labor force that we have and make them better and able to contribute. That's one angle. The second angle to look at it, which you know, people argue is you know, maybe not the most positive, is I like to believe that as a private sector player, going beyond, you know, providing information so that it can be useful to other people, what you can do, and I use myself as an example, is begin to shape people's preferences so that we're creating an economy that's better and easier to handle. And I'll give you an example because that sounds arbitrary. When I was younger, throughout my university, every summer I would do an internship. And I was laughed at because I really never had fun in university, and I don't regret it. I worked at PwC, ECOWAS, name it, and I did all these internships. And I came out because I knew what I wanted to do with my life, right? I wanted to work in certain kinds of places. So I came out and I was immediately employable because I had skills that organizations were looking for. But that was because of my mindset. So if private players begin to demand certain skill sets from the labor market, then they automatically shape what people do, making the resources that we have a bit more useful. It's the way in economics we say, you know, the supplier can sort of shape consumer preferences or can sort of determine what people buy because of what they stock. So if you demand that people have certain kinds of skill set, then you automatically shape their preferences and you automatically have a way of creating a better labor force.
Wow.
So that is where I feel, you know, private sector can contribute. First is, you know, data, and second is creating a mindset or a culture for young people to want to overachieve.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well said. Mr. Yemi, not Adeyemi.
Yeah, so when she says that, what do I want to say? So I would just roll it back to, you know, take what she had said, bring it into the tech space, and we talk through it. So when you talk about data, I think she's very right. The private sector has humongous data. I think for us is, what are you doing with that data? In the tech space, we call it big data. With big data, again, just to unpack it, you hear the word big data. There are so many opportunities from that word big data that new skills are being developed. Today, we find ourselves in the world that, anyway, I did statistics as for my first degree. But today, there is a new word called data scientist. It's the same thing, right? But it is using data, critically analyzing it, and using it for the good of the organization you're looking at, or for the purpose it is being set aside for. So yes, there is so much data everywhere, but how well are we mining it? and we have people who can mine it. Mining it from a standpoint of using it as a platform for growth, entrepreneurship, employability. Once we get the right analysis of what is that gap, then organizations can feed into that gap and develop it. It is no, how do I call it? It is no brainer that there is a huge skill gap in this country. And it is looking for where that gap is and looking for organizations who can feed in to deliver on those settings.
Thank you very much. We had an agreement, right? You remember? Okay, we're doing well. Yes, sir.
It's not only the issue of demands and supply.
Okay.
We have to consider choice. When the public sector is there,
sorry, could you please move the microphone towards?
Private sector is there, so you have a choice. Are you going for National Population Commission to get a data, or are you going for a private organization to get data? Because we are a consumer, we should produce what a consumer wants to consume, not what you want the consumer to consume. So you have to be careful. Choice is very important in economics. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
So I'll go through the three core things that we're talking about: education, employment, then empowerment. So in terms of education, the private sector has a huge role to play in on-the-job training. I think some continuous learning is something that we don't appreciate as Nigerians, but it's very important. When you graduate from university, in the next 5 years, in fact, in the next year, things have changed. So I think the private sector has a huge role to play in that. Something that has been mentioned previously is this preparation for the 21st century, jobs of the 21st century. And I think the tech sector has a huge role to play in that. AI is coming into play, robotics. We're in the fourth industrial revolution, to be honest, but Nigeria is still in the second industrial revolution because we don't still have electricity, exactly. We need to tackle that, but then as we prepare for the fourth industrial revolution, we need to ensure that we're training people adequately for that. Employment, I'd just like to talk through some numbers. So Nigeria specifically needs to create about 1.3 million jobs annually to be able to harness the demographic dividends. In the whole of Africa, it's about 22.5 million jobs annually. When President Buhari was running, I think the number that was often mentioned was 360,000 jobs. The public sector can only do so much. Between 2014 and 2016, the private sector was producing about 1.1 million jobs annually. So the private sector is key for employment opportunities. We need to create jobs as the private sector. So in employment, the private sector is also key here, creating the right jobs. When you talk about empowerment, then you talk about big data. We need to ensure that people are aware of things. So Facebook, Twitter, that's how people get their news these days. So the private sector has a huge role to ensure that people are aware so that they can make the right decisions, vote the right people into office, and utilize data adequately to change our education system, for example. So I think those are the three core ways I would think about.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. And now, thinking about this entrepreneurship, thank you, entrepreneurship, education, and employability. And the first speaker talked about sustainability and data, and the second panelist talked about data plus. That's how we describe what you said, data plus. The doctor mentioned to us about choice, and she went all through to the three. I was thinking that probably one of the things we can start to do as private sector organizations to include in our CSR initiative that we take to universities, for example, and tertiary institutions, is to start having employability skills development. As much as private sector should position to attract, or rather should let everybody know what the skill they require to employ people, as much as that is important, I think it's also important that we catch them young, let me say, that we're not waiting till they graduate and then we employ them and start to train them. I think a lot can be done while they're in school, even if not to give them hands-on and everything we can, but to give them an idea to know what to expect. And I'm saying that because of what we do in my organization. We get to work with many young people who aspire to become something, but they don't have the tools that they require. And what made her the decision to do internship while she was in school was probably because she was she had some information available to her. Some young people don't. So that's probably one of the things we may want to start considering. And it is education, by the way. It is education. And now expanding it into education proper. How do you think that investing in education, we're looking at three things. We're looking at entrepreneurship, we're looking at employability, but now to education. Because with education now we're talking about people lower than the employment age. How do you think investing in education can help us as a nation to harness the DD that we're talking about today? So we do ladies first again.
So I might have to repeat some things I've said, but I will also use figures. So in Nigeria at the moment, the adult literacy rate is about 50%, which is significantly low. And so it's clear that there's a lot of work to be done in education. So when you think about education, there are a couple of stages, right? So you think about getting more people into the education system, and then you think about quality of education. And I think enrollment is a problem, completion is a problem, but quality is also a huge problem. And that goes back to the concept of employability. Are we producing people to fill in the right jobs? Or are we producing people for the jobs that we need? We keep saying we want to focus on agriculture, for example, but then we're not training enough agricultural economists, for example, or people that are skilled in nutrition, for example. So we need, that employability component is very key for starters. Quality of education, both through tracking data to ensure that we're tracking our teachers and seeing the results, and then we can then fine-tune the system so that it's actually addressing the need. I think it's somewhere that the private sector can play. Entrepreneurship training, mentorships, and internships are very key to not just a school education, but education from school to actual working life. So I think that's another sector. And as I mentioned previously, preparing the youth for the 21st century, jobs of the 21st century, is something that the private sector can, a place that the private sector can also play.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you.
I think the private sector can come into development of our curriculum. Because the main problem we are facing now, there is no correlation between our education and entrepreneurship. So they have to come and make sure that the theory and practice are the same. But what they are teaching us in the university is different from what we can see as far as entrepreneurship is concerned. And there is need for private sector to come into development of Department of Economics, because in the Department of Economics we have subject population, so they can finance the issue of population, so that we understand the population is not about the figure. By saying that Lagos State have maybe 10 million, Kano State have so million. Population is talking about socio-economic characteristics.
Yes.
That is your education, your level of education. Are you working or you are not working? So that population can have information that public organization, private organization can use it for planning. That is the importance of population commission.
Fantastic.
Not just to say figure, Kano State, Lagos State, Katsina State, and what have you. No. Then there is need to have a cooperation between our institutions from the primary school, secondary school, and tertiary institution, and private sector. Because private sector are the consumers, after all what produced for them. But at times the government produce, but the consumers are not consuming what they produce. So you have to be careful about it. So there is a need for a cordial relationship between private sector and public sector for economic growth and economic development of Nigeria, in order to see the dividends of demographic dividends in Nigeria.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. So as we go into the 21st century, I think what we should be looking at is, from an education standpoint, is self-awareness. So the 21st century is just around the corner. We are in the fourth industrial revolution, where digital transformation is taking everything. Right, I'm going to hitch my conversation around 4 pillars, right? First and foremost, in organizations today, if you want to play in this fourth industrial revolution, first and foremost, how well are you engaging with your consumers, right? How are you empowering your employees, right? How are you transforming your product, and how are you optimizing your operations? Those 4 pillars.
I'm sorry, so that we just get it well. So consumer engagement.
Consumer engagement.
Yes.
Empowering your
Empowering
employees,
yes.
Optimizing your operations,
Yes.
and transforming your products. Gone are those days you have your yellow cabs. Where are they now? Uber has taken over. Where are those guys that way back then you have the video clubs? Netflix has taken over. YouTube has taken over. That is the transformation we are talking about. Now, do we have young people having those skills out from the university, or are those skills being inculcated into the curriculum, starting from the primary, secondary, to the university, to meet those jobs that you've rightly said for the 21st century? I still say education is very key. It doesn't have to be what you learn in the classroom. I've been at Microsoft for 5 years. I've done 4, 5, 6 courses at Kellogg's, but I've been in Nigeria, trust me. So what are you doing online? I say it so much. We have a young population, or the youth population, that they do rubbish. I use the word rubbish online. What would empower them for the next level? They don't think about it. So education is not just what you learn in the 4 corners of the university or the classroom. There are platforms out there that are there for you to empower yourself. I'm going to say this. At Microsoft, we have something called Cloud Society. On that platform, you get certifications, FOC, that will enable you for the 21st century.
Wow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And finally.
I quite agree with everything that has been said, but again, because of my background, I like to break things down to their component
From the
points.
economics perspective.
So, so education and curriculum development is broad, but there are different elements in it. And I'll use myself as an example because really I only know myself. I find you can improve on the curriculum and it does not directly trickle down into the teaching materials and the modes used to transfer knowledge to the students. So it's good to say we're improving the curriculum, but more importantly, private sector should be directly influencing teaching materials. In universities, for example, the students that scored the highest in kind of universities I went to were the ones that directly quoted the case studies that we were given. And these case studies were case studies of private companies, Google, etc. And you were immediately exposed to the sort of work that these companies were doing. So you knew the sort of things to be equipping yourself with to become an asset and to add value to these companies. So more importantly, beyond improving on the curriculum, private sector should begin to directly contribute to teaching materials. That's one. Another, again, is the mode of teaching. I remember the first time a Deloitte employee walked into the classroom as one of our guest lecturers, just from, excuse my language, the packaging, I knew this was where I was headed. I knew that, I was like, you know what, this is what I want to do with my life. So again, if you begin to bring in private sector players to serve as key instructors, to begin to transfer knowledge, it sort of works with young people. We're visual. So when you bring in someone from IBM, from Microsoft, from Deloitte, from KPMG, to actually deliver the lectures, taking into consideration their background and what they do on a day-to-day basis at work, it has a way of making the difficult concepts seem more real to young people because of the aesthetics surrounding the person delivering it. That's one. So
that's two.
That's not two, but sorry. And then because of the way Nigeria is, because I don't believe, we're all bad, there's an informal component that we tend to overlook when we're talking about education. We have a lot of people currently acquiring skills in the informal sector. I think the private sector has a strong role to play in dignifying these skills that they're acquiring. So they're not seen as substandard. They're not seen as second best. That's one. And I
That's three.
think- Oh,
That's three.
Oh,
Okay.
okay,
I'm
three. My
counting.
numbering.
Yeah.
And apart from dignifying, begin to create jobs that absorb people with such skills, so that when they're in educational facilities acquiring these skills, they're a bit more motivated. Because you go to polytechnics and you're like, they're not as motivated as you would expect, people acquiring knowledge to be, because knowledge is power. It is power. So the private sector needs to begin to find ways to dignify these softer skills, so that people in the educational sector getting these kind of skills are proud to do it.
Wow.
So those are my
Thank you.
small
Thank you
additions.
very much. Thank you. Could you please help me appreciate everybody on the panel?